Hello and welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Today we look at how a police investigation has resulted in the dismantling of a complex drugs ring which has distributed heroin and cocaine across Sussex, South East London and Kent. It led to convictions of 16 people, including 2 ringleaders who were convicted and sentenced at Hove Crown Court to life imprisonment for conspiracy to murder. Police said Leo Ellis from Hastings and his associate Jason Caswell acted as main drug dealers supplying cocaine and, in Mr Ellis's case, heroin too, across East Sussex and Kent. They ran a drugs ring supplying the area with illegal substances from their suppliers. However, the work of Sussex police detectives identified this ring and the locations from where they ran their illegal operation. In a succession of major raids and arrests, officers seized a large amount of drugs and cash over several months in 2015 and 2016. Because of the seizures, by February 2016, Mr Ellis and Mr Caswell owed their dealers in excess of £850,000. Police said their inability to repay the debts was then worsened by further seizures of £92,000 cash, and 2 kilos of cocaine were made within 3 days that month. In total, £1.4 million in Class A drugs and £100,000 cash was seized by police officers working closely with the National Crime Agency. Detectives continued their surveillance on them as Mr Ellis and Mr Caswell came under increasing pressure to compensate their suppliers for the seizures. They used mobile phones to send emails discussing what had happened and what they were going to do about it. Police said detailed examination of mobile phones identified vitally important messages between Mr Ellis and Mr Caswell in which they talk about arranging the murders. Records of conversations recorded by police at Mr Ellis's address feature one in which he boasted of having acquired guns and ammunition from Eastern Europe. In another recording, he discussed with Mr Caswell plans to recruit someone to carry out the killings. Detectives were able to work out that Mr Ellis and Mr Caswell had decided to eliminate their debts by murdering the people they owed money to rather than pay back the £1.4 million in drugs and cash the police had seized. Police said Mr Ellis and Mr Caswell planned together and Mr Ellis arranged for another associate, Jamie Winchester, to supply a weapon, a TEC-9 style 9mm automatic submachine gun pistol with a silencer and ammunition. A surveillance photo captured Mr Winchester cycling away from a drop-off point in Cinque Ports Way, Hastings, having supplied the gun which had been in a bag strapped to his back on March 1st, 2016. Police officers were able to track their movements and the gun and ammunition were seized before any murders could take place. After a complex surveillance operation, 2 arrests were made of Anthony Hearn and a woman who was not charged with any offences in Hastings town centre on the afternoon on March 1st, 2016, and the weapon and ammunition was seized in the footwell of their car in Wellington Square. It was in a bag which contained a silencer and 16 rounds of ammunition, police said. The gun was a fully working machine pistol capable of firing up to 900 rounds per minute. After extensive inquiries, officers raided Mr Winchester's home in Sandy Close, St Leonards in December 2016 and arrested him. Mr Ellis and Mr Caswell faced a 10-week trial together with 3 associates, Jamie Winchester, John Gardner and Simon Grant. Police said Mr Ellis and Mr Caswell pleaded not guilty to conspiracy to murder and drugs supply offences. Mr Caswell also pleaded not guilty to money laundering and conspiracy to supply cocaine. Mr Winchester pleaded not guilty to supplying the gun and ammunition. John Gardner pleaded not guilty to drug supply offences. Simon Grant pleaded not guilty to drug supply and money laundering offences. Leo Allen Ellis, 24, unemployed, of Mountbatten Close, Hastings, was found guilty and was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 14 years for conspiracy to murder 2 people. He was also given 10 years for supplying a firearm, 14 years for each of the 3 counts of conspiracy to supply heroin, 8 years for 1 count of conspiracy to supply cocaine, and another 2 years for a second of the same offence, and a further 16 years for another offence of conspiracy to supply cocaine, 2 years for money laundering. Mr. Ellis pleaded guilty to the money laundering and cocaine offences before the trial. Jason Caswell, 41, a road worker of Credon Walk, London, was found guilty and was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 14 years for conspiracy to murder 2 men. He was also sentenced to 14 years and 16 years for 2 counts of conspiracy to supply cocaine and 3 years for money laundering. Detective Chief Inspector Andy Bennett of the Sussex Police Organised Crime Unit said, "This operation has been a significant and extremely complex investigation into drug dealing and money laundering by Mr. Ellis in Sussex and Mr. Caswell in Kent. Both Mr. Ellis and Mr. Caswell had autonomy over the drug supply in their home areas and both became equally indebted to their suppliers. Our interventions had a major impact on their criminality and placed a significant pressure on their mounting debts. They believed their only way out of this situation was to plan on killing their suppliers, clearly showing the extreme and drastic action those in the drugs world are willing to take." Leo Ellis's dwindling position within the drugs ring became clear to us as we learned from our investigation of how his huge debts and inability or unwillingness to repay them despite pressure to do so. However, we had the group under surveillance and their intentions were confirmed by emails that we were able to access and by covert recordings of conversations at Mr. Ellis's home. This has been a major operation for my team, working with those close cooperation and support of the National Crime Agency throughout, for which we are extremely grateful. It shows the determination of law enforcement at both national and force level to work successfully together in order to effectively tackle organised crime to protect the public from dangerous criminals such as these men. The operation was the culminating phase of a major inquiry and another example of the way in which, working with our law enforcement partners, we are constantly attacking organised crime and frustrating its efforts to become embedded in our communities. The devastating effect on the drugs misuse can have a much wider impact than simply on the person who takes them. It can corrode the quality of life for local communities and affect the health of those who are drawn into it. The fully working submachine gun we recovered was capable of firing up to 900 rounds per minute and was quite obviously a lethal weapon. Thankfully, this has now been taken off our streets. It is vital that we continue to receive support from our communities so we can effectively tackle crime and take weapons like this off our streets for good. David Renders of the National Crime Agency said, "Those sentenced were dangerous drug traffickers intent on committing horrendous crimes. With access to an automated weapon, they posed a significant danger to ordinary members of the public, let alone their enemies." NCA officers worked in close collaboration with their colleagues in Sussex Police during this investigation, sharing resources and intelligence and providing specialist support to the operation. Through partners such as this one, we and our law enforcement colleagues are protecting the public from serious and organised crime. Anthony Hearn had been arrested, with a woman who was not later prosecuted for any related offences for possessing the gun when it was found in the car in Hastings on March 1st, 2016. In July 2016, Mr. Hearn was sentenced to 11 years imprisonment after admitting possessing the firearm with intent to endanger life or enabling another to do so, possessing a prohibited automatic weapon, and possessing ammunition for a firearm without a certificate. 6 other men were also sentenced for their part in the plot and associated drugs ring. Jamie Peter Winchester, 25, unemployed, of Sandy Close, St Leonards, was found guilty and was sentenced to 7 years for supplying the TEC-9 style 9mm automatic submachine gun pistol with a silencer and 3 years for possessing ammunition. John Gardner, 41, unemployed, of Egerton Road, Bexhill, was found guilty and was sentenced to 6 years for 2 offences of conspiracy to supply heroin and 9 years for conspiracy to supply cocaine. Scott Gardner, 40, a carpet fitter of Bexhill Road, St Leonards, was sentenced to 12 months, having pleaded guilty before the trial to money laundering. Wesley Long, 40, a tyre fitter of Harold Road, Hastings, was sentenced to 3 years, having admitted before the trial conspiracy to supply cocaine. Simon Grant, 45, a painter of Sheriff Road, London, was found not guilty of conspiracy to supply cocaine and money laundering. He had also separately pleaded guilty to possession of cannabis with intent to supply and was sentenced to 5 months, suspended for 18 months. Kenny Kelly, 37, unemployed, of Magony Close, London. Stephen Kelly, 48, unemployed, of Dominion Drive, London, and Anthony Hearn, 45, unemployed, of no fixed address, were found not guilty of conspiracy to murder the 2 people. James Dunham, 37, unemployed, of Roundhouse Crescent, Peach Haven, did not appear at court to be sentenced for conspiracy to supply cocaine and will be sentenced at a later date. Judge Christine Lane said to Mr. Ellis and Mr. Caswell, "You are utterly ruthless men who were ready to murder 2 people. Over £1 million worth of drugs and over £100,000 in cash was seized in the constant battle against Class A drugs." She commended all the police officers and staff in the operation, which she said had often involved working very long hours. In separate proceedings in 2015 and 2016, 7 other people had been sentenced as a result of the same police investigation associated with the extensive drugs ring. At Hastings Magistrate Court, Amelia Stock, 21, unemployed, of Mountbatten Close, Hastings, admitting offering to supply cannabis and was sentenced to 60 hours unpaid community work and a £60 fine. Kobe Lloyd, 19, unemployed, of London Road, Bexhill, admitting offering to supply cannabis and was given a 12-month suspended sentence and 100 hours of unpaid community work. 5 men were convicted and sentenced at Crown Court after acting as drugs runners for Mr. Ellis and Mr. Caswell. Christopher Walsh, also known as Marsh, 31, then of Holmhurst Lane, Hastings, was given 56 months imprisonment at Oxford Crown Court for possession with intent to supply 1 kilo of heroin. Luke Fitzgerald, 28, of Edinburgh Road, St Leonard's, was given 40 months imprisonment at Oxford Crown Court for possession with intent to supply 1 kilo of heroin. Carlton Meldrum, 25, of The Ridge, St Leonard's, received a 5-year sentence for possession of 3 kilos of heroin with intent to supply. He was further sentenced at Snaresbrook Crown Court to 7 years for a further offence of possession of 3 kilos of heroin with intent to supply. Jed Bullard, 28, of Moor Lane, Westfield, near Hastings, was sentenced at Lewes Crown Court to 10 years for conspiracy to supply cocaine, possession with intent to supply MDMA and meth, and amphetamine, possession of cannabis, money laundering, and possessing an offensive weapon. Palv Rinslick, 21, then of Victoria Avenue, Hastings, was sentenced to 4 years for conspiracy to supply cocaine and possession of heroin. So what are your thoughts about this Sussex-based drugs ring that was led by Mr. Ellis and Mr. Caswell, along with numerous associates and runners, and due to raids against their drugs ring, started to plot to murder their suppliers over a substantial drugs debt? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, stay safe.